So, I'd like to talk about type, especially in this lesson, the anatomy of type. We're going to talk about the basics of type and typefaces this week, and we're going to speak about how Roman typefaces are made and their various parts and the various ways that we see them in the world. Now, type is a strange thing. It's a bunch of symbols that mean things. They mean sounds, and they're put together, and we create words and communicate with them. Type has a voice. Type can communicate just by its personal physical style. The work that we create with type is oftentimes very different, and when we use type, we need to use different typefaces for different purposes. So some of those will become more obvious as this lesson goes on, but again, as a student, expect to learn a lot over the next few years as you use type and learn about ways to be more powerful and effective with your type choices. So let's look at the anatomy of type. This would be Times New Roman, and it is a very common typeface. I've chosen all capital letters here. And what we want to do is we want to know what we call the parts of these letters. So the first thing we'll talk about are the stems of a letter. Any letter that you have in a Roman typeface has a stem that holds it up. Now, O's and C's and things like that, they might violate that rule, but most letters have a stem. It is the strong, upright portion of the letter that defines its shape. You know, an M and an N have multiple stems, but there's usually considered the very first stroke of the letter, and we call these line strokes. These are the stems, and then we would see that they're made up of heavy stroke elements. Again, a stroke is the lines that we create text with. So the heavy stroke elements are the ones where if you were writing with a pen, a quill pen, on downstrokes, you'll get more ink, and upstrokes, you'll get lighter ink, or cross strokes. So the initial design of Roman typefaces followed the idea of writing with a pen. So these heavy stroke elements oftentimes are the strongest vertical lines and shapes. We also have thin stroke elements. These are the connecting points that hold heavy stroke elements together, and oftentimes are the part that defines what the letter is. A lot of times the heavy stroke elements are the same in a lot of letters, but then the thin stroke lines are where we see the real difference between each character. Some typefaces, a lot of common typefaces like Times New Roman, also include these cute little hooks, and these are called serifs. Serifs help our eye complete lines and strokes, help us to track a letter and perceive it even if it's small. These actually were leftovers from when carvings were done on buildings. As the stonemasons would carve, this helped them complete the letter and make it less likely that the letter would crumble in the stone. But it's also really useful. Serifs are really useful for making small type readable or large type readable from a long distance away. So those are the four primary parts we're going to talk about: heavy stroke, thin stroke, serifs, and stems. So let's see how a row of type will look. Whoa. Okay, so the assessment that you're going to be having to work on is going to look a lot like this. You're going to see the call outs with arrows, and you're going to label this. Let's talk about this row of type, and you'll notice there's upper and lowercase letters. A lot of interesting things I've highlighted in different colors. So let's take a quick look at the beginning of the line. You'll notice that Roman typefaces sit on what is called the baseline. The bottom of the H, the bottom of the R sit directly on that baseline. And at the very top, we have the ascender line. The ascender line defines the top where capital letters and lowercase letters normally sit. At the very bottom is what we call the descender line, where descenders from lowercase and the capital letter Q dangle down to. And that serves a purpose in allowing each row of type to know where each row begins on the next line of type. You'll also notice on the top of the Y and the R and the O, you'll see what's called the waistline. And it also helps define a space called the X height, but we'll talk about that in a few moments. You'll notice that we have a capital letter, an H, and uppercase is the proper term for it. So we'll call it uppercase letters. And you'll also see lowercase letters highlighted in green here. The green letters, D, R, and O, are lowercase letters. You'll notice that the Y and the P have these cute little pink dangly things at the bottom, and we call those magenta items. We call them descenders because they've descended below the baseline. You'll also notice that there are these blue highlighted areas that are ascenders. They've ascended above the waistline or the X height of the letters. In orange are identified bowls. Bowls are the center enclosed areas of letters like O or P or Q or D. Anytime you see a closed space, that is a bowl. Now, a bowl is a kind of space that isn't where the letter is. It's the opposite of where the letter is. It's negative space. It's white space. Those help define what those letters are. But you'll notice in this yellow color, space in between letters, space that is not the letter itself, but the outside defining area of the space, we call those counter areas. Now, bowls are a kind of counter area. And when you see space between letters, the counter area oftentimes helps dictate whether a word is beginning or ending. And we can control that spacing. We'll talk about that next week. If you look at these brown sections that I've identified, you'll notice the first one starting at the baseline and going up to the waistline. We call that the X height. I've mentioned that before. That is the height of the letter X. Sometimes you'll see that rounded letters might extend past that because they're being visually designed to look the same size as, say, a letter I, and they just use things for, well, it's a science actually to determine a way to show that type needs to look the correct size for its partners. So sometimes you'll see letters creep out past there, and you can see the C is actually extended a little past. The other brown line going from the ascender line down to the bottom of the descender line, that is the point size. And of course, you're probably already used to what point size is that type. So a point is a 72nd of an inch, and at whatever space there is between those two lines, the top of the ascenders and the bottom of the descenders is the point size of that type. Okay, so let's look at some other elements that we need to know. We've already mentioned serifs. Now, a serif adds a little hook, as you can see, and it does help make small type easy to read or distant type easy to read. It also does force the letters to be slightly farther apart. And I've taken that font, and it's Times New Roman, and I've actually taken that font and I used the Pathfinder tool to delete the serifs from this letter. You'll notice it's pretty different, although it is really the same font. Let's go back. You can see the character really changes. The definition of those shapes is much more emphatic. It's kind of like putting an exclamation point at the end of each stroke of the letters. So serifs and sans serif. Sometimes you'll hear people say sans serif, but that's only if you're a fancy European guy like me. But I just say sans serif, just like an American. When we talk about serifs and sans serifs, we're talking about some major families of type, some classifications of type. So serif, you can see there's all different kinds of serif shapes. Some are squared off, some are rounded, some are sharp and edgy. Now, when we talk about serif fonts specifically, we're talking about fonts being used for reading in small type in books, in text. So a serif text font is oftentimes designed for good readability at small and large sizes. And these would be a real mix of different serif fonts. Sans serif fonts or sans serif fonts. Again, here's another sampling of these sans serif fonts. They can have all different kinds of expressiveness, different kinds of presentations. They're oftentimes used for a more modern look. Mixing sans serif and serif fonts together is a good thing. It adds contrast in your design. And sans serif fonts can be very easy to read, especially in small sizes, but you need to pick who your client is, what the voice of this font is, what is the attitude, and you'll hear a train in the background, so I'm just going to keep on talking anyway. So sans serif and serif fonts are very common, and you'll find hundreds and hundreds and thousands online. But sometimes you're going to find fonts called display fonts, and these have a lot of character. These really display a dramatic voice, and you'll notice that when you use these, you would never want to read small type in these fonts. They're meant to be funny or arrogant or weak or strong or pushy or obnoxious, or pick a character. You can find a font that will work with a display font. Oftentimes they're very easy to read. A lot of times they don't come with the lowercase version of that font. So remember, picking a display font is a contrasty thing. You're using it to add a little pop to a design, and use them sparingly. Use them for headers and titles, but use them. They're pretty cool. Another type of font out there, and these are actually based on, script fonts are based on handwriting, or at least a computer generated version of handwriting. You'll notice that they're connected. Each letter is connected as if it was a cursive letter. And those cursive letters then flow more. They have movement and generate a rhythm with their extra shapes. They're very flamboyant. They're sometimes very loud. They can be used for very delicate things, though, too. You can use them for wedding invitations, but you can use them for a logo, just to add some zip, zing, and pizzazz to your design. So script fonts, don't forget them. They're out there. And don't use brush script, please. Lastly, we want to talk about how fonts also have what we call style, font style. And style comes in the differences of the weight and the form of letters. Here I've chosen Gill Sans, one of my favorite fonts. And you can see we go from ultra bold, bold, semi-bold, regular, light. Sometimes you'll see terms like demi or medium. There's different ways that different fonts can be scaled up and scaled down in weight to be used in multiple places in one document, but keep a family likeness throughout a document. We also can change the form of letters, and the most common form change would be italic. It's not just that they've tilted the letter, they tilt it and they start doing things like pinching the letters in certain ways very distinctly. Sometimes you'll see letters like G and I that change very differently between the italic and um, the standard version of that font. Not every font has an italic. Not every font has a bold or a light. These font styles go along with the more comprehensive families out there. So when you have a common font like Times or Arial, you will see a real variety of sizes and weights and forms. So keep an eye out for fonts when you're using them so that you have more tools to create with. It's always great to have display fonts, but when you have one font that has a lot of different weight and form options, you can use the same font and really create a lot of unity in your design. So that is a basic anatomy of types and typefaces and typography. Next week, we're going to talk more about typography. We're going to talk about how we lay out a page and what ways we can change spacing and alignment with type. So that is the anatomy of type.